Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to be tackling the Republican Party,
Oh, yeah.
which, you hear about them all the time, right?
Right.
But we're going to show you how much more there is to it.
Yeah.
It's like thinking, a city just because you drove through downtown,
Mm-hmm.
but then you discover all these cool, unique neighborhoods
Right.
with, their own vibes.
Exactly. The Republican Party isn't just one big block.
Right.
It's actually made up of all these different wings,
Yeah.
each with its own history, priorities, and even personalities.
Yeah, and we're going to take you on a tour of 8 of the most influential ones.
Okay.
Traditional conservatives, fiscal conservatives, social conservatives,
Okay.
libertarians, populist nationalist conservatives, sometimes called Trumpism,
Right.
Tea Party conservatives, neoconservatives, and paleoconservatives.
Wow.
Get ready for some aha moments,
Yeah.
because you might be surprised by what you learn.
Let's start with a group that's often seen as the foundation of the party. The traditional conservatives.
Right.
They're all about those classic Republican values,
Yeah.
limited government free markets, a strong national defense,
Uh-huh.
and a generally conservative approach to social issues.
So if you picture them as the folks who believe in individual responsibility,
Yes.
fiscal responsibility, and a slow and steady approach to change, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
Think about them advocating for lower taxes,
Yes.
fewer regulations,
Yeah.
and a powerful military.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
While they champion free markets, traditional conservatives sometimes support government intervention
Real.
when it benefits businesses.
Ah.
For example, they've historically been in favor of agricultural subsidies.
Oh, wow.
Which, if you think about it, kind of goes against that whole hands-off free market ideal.
It really does. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really good point.
Yeah.
It shows that even within a single wing,
Right.
there are always nuances and sometimes even contradictions. It's not as black and white as it might seem from the outside.
Exactly.
So what are some of the key issues that really get traditional conservatives fired up?
Well, they're definitely focused on things like free trade agreements,
Okay.
maintaining a strong military presence around the world, and keeping taxes low, especially for businesses.
And are those issues playing out in the real world right now?
Absolutely. Just look at the debates happening over trade deals,
Okay.
military spending,
Yeah.
and how much corporations should be taxed.
Okay.
Traditional conservatives often find themselves pushing back against the more protectionist America First policies you see coming from the populist nationalist wing,
Yeah.
which we'll get to later.
Okay, so it's like a little bit of an old guard versus new guard dynamic playing out within the party.
Exactly.
So speaking of the old guard, when you think of traditional conservatives, who comes to mind?
Well, Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, he's practically the face of the GOP establishment. He's a master strategist and has been incredibly effective at pushing traditional conservative priorities.
I bet most people don't know.
That he's actually a bit of a history buff.
Really?
With a particular interest in the Civil War. He even wrote a book about Kentucky's role in the conflict.
Wow, that is surprising.
Yeah.
Just goes to show that there's always more to these political figures than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
So how much power do traditional conservatives actually have in today's Republican Party?
Their influence has definitely lessened in recent years, especially with the rise of populism.
Right.
But they still have considerable sway because they control a lot of the party machinery, like the RNC.
Okay.
And they have close ties to major donors.
Gotcha.
So they're not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah.
But they are facing some serious challenges.
So it's like they're holding on to their base.
Yes.
But the ground beneath them is definitely shifting.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to a wing that's all about the bottom line.
Okay.
Fiscal conservatives.
These are the folks who live and breathe economic issues.
Okay.
They want smaller government, balanced budgets, lower taxes, and less government spending.
Right.
You could say their motto is, keep Uncle Sam's hands out of our wallets.
I love it.
Yeah.
So what are some of their hot button issues?
Think tax reform,
Okay.
slashing government programs, and reducing the national debt.
Okay.
They probably get a little queasy every time they hear about the government spending more than it takes.
I bet. And these are issues that are constantly in the news, right?
All the time.
Yeah.
The debates we're seeing about government spending, social programs, and even infrastructure projects, those are all right in fiscal conservatives' wheelhouse.
Okay.
They often argue that when the government gets too involved in the economy, it actually stifles growth and leads to inefficiency.
So basically they're saying that the free market knows best. Okay, so Who are some of the big names associated with this wing?
Well, Rand Paul and Ted Cruz are two who immediately come to mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Ted Cruz really made a statement about fiscal conservatism a few years back, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. Back in 2013, he used the government shutdown as a tactic to try to defund Obamacare.
Right.
It was a bold move.
Yeah.
And some would say controversial.
Yeah.
But it definitely showed how committed he is to limiting the role of government, even in healthcare.
Wow. That was definitely a defining moment.
Yeah.
So how much clout do fiscal conservatives actually have in today's Republican Party?
They have a lot of influence, especially in the House of Representatives.
Okay.
Groups like the Freedom Caucus, which is made up of some very conservative House Republicans, they're constantly pushing for fiscal restraint and have even been known to challenge their own party's leadership when it comes to spending bills.
Wow. So they're not afraid to make some noise and stand up for what they believe in.
Right.
Even if it means going against the flow.
That's right.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about a wing that's had a big impact on the social landscape. Social conservatives.
These are the folks who are deeply rooted in traditional Christian values.
Okay.
And advocate for a strong moral code in society. Their main focus is on issues like family values, opposing abortion, and protecting religious freedom.
So they're really concerned with upholding what they see as the moral fabric of the nation.
Exactly.
Often based on their religious beliefs.
Right. And they're not just talking about these issues. They're actively working to influence policy.
So what are some of their key issues?
Well, things like banning abortion, promoting traditional marriage, and opposing LGBTQ plus rights are all high on their list. And they've been pretty effective at pushing their agenda, too.
Really?
Just look at the recent Supreme Court decisions on abortion and religious freedom.
Right.
Social conservatives have been working for years to get conservative judges appointed to the courts.
Yeah. And these victories have energized their base.
It's a reminder that these debates aren't just theoretical. They have real-world consequences.
Exactly.
And who are some of the most prominent figures in this wing?
Mike Pence and Rick Santorum are two names that are practically synonymous with social conservatism.
And Mike Pence especially has really been a vocal champion for social conservative causes throughout his career, hasn't he?
Absolutely. Remember back when he was governor of Indiana?
Yeah.
He signed that controversial religious freedom law that was widely seen as discriminatory against LGBTQ plus individuals.
Yeah.
That really solidified his position as a leader in the social conservative movement.
Yeah, that definitely made headlines.
It did.
So how much influence do social conservatives have in today's GOP?
They're a powerful force, particularly within the party's grassroots.
Okay.
They have a real knack for mobilizing voters around social issues, especially in more conservative states.
Which gives them a lot of leverage.
It sounds like they might not always be the loudest voices.
Right.
But they're definitely effective at getting things done.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to a wing that's all about individual liberty.
Okay.
The Libertarians.
Now, these are the folks who champion individual freedom above all else.
Okay.
They're skeptical of government intervention in both economic and social matters.
Okay.
You could say they're the live and let live wing of the Republican Party.
I like that.
Yeah.
So they want the government off your back.
Yes.
Whether it's about your money, your personal choices, or even how much America gets involved in foreign conflicts.
That's right. They want to maximize individual liberty and minimize the role of the state.
But that approach can put them at odds with other Republicans, right?
Definitely, especially when it comes to things like military intervention, or social programs.
Yeah.
Libertarians tend to favor a more hands-off foreign policy and believe that social safety nets should be scaled back or even eliminated altogether.
It seems like they really believe in self-reliance and personal responsibility.
Yes.
Even if it means some people might struggle.
Right.
So what are some of their key issues?
Reducing government regulation.
Okay.
Defending civil liberties. And promoting free market principles.
Okay.
Even when it comes to things like drug policy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. These are all big for them.
So if I had to guess, I'd say Libertarians are probably passionate about legalizing marijuana.
Yes.
Ending the war on drugs. Cutting back on government surveillance programs.
Yes.
And reducing America's military footprint around the world.
You nailed it.
Okay.
And these issues are constantly popping up in the news.
Right.
Whether it's debates about privacy in the digital age, the effectiveness of the war on drugs, or whether we should be spending less on the military.
Right.
Libertarian voices are often right in the middle of these conversations, even if they aren't always the ones you hear the loudest.
So who comes to mind when you think of libertarianism within the GOP?
Well, Rand Paul is probably the most prominent and vocal libertarian in the Republican Party.
Right.
He's constantly challenging his own party's stance on issues like foreign intervention, government surveillance, and criminal justice reform.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's definitely not afraid to go against the grain, even if it ruffles some feathers.
Nope.
I read somewhere that he's also a licensed ophthalmologist.
That's right.
Really?
And you know what's even more interesting?
Right.
He actually performed eye surgery for years without a medical license.
What?
He eventually got his license reinstated.
Oh, wow.
But it's definitely a story that shows you his independent streak and his willingness to challenge the status quo.
Wow. That is a great anecdote. It really gives you some insight into his personality.
Definitely.
So, given his prominence, how much influence would you say libertarians have within the Republican Party as a whole?
Their influence is definitely less than some of the other wings we've talked about.
Okay.
However, they have a strong intellectual base in think tanks, like the Cato Institute. And their ideas resonate with a lot of younger conservatives who are wary of big government.
Right.
So while they might not be calling the shots right now, their influence is likely to grow in the coming years.
So they're kind of planting seeds that could take root later on.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about a wing that's been making a lot of headlines lately.
Okay.
The populist nationalist conservatives, often referred to as Trumpism.
This wing really exploded onto the scene with the rise of Donald Trump.
Right.
And they've shaken things up in the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Their core beliefs revolve around putting America first, promoting economic nationalism, and rejecting what they see as globalist elites.
So they're sort of like the disruptors, right? Shaking things up and challenging the establishment.
Exactly.
They seem to connect with voters who feel like globalization and political correctness have left them behind.
You're exactly right. They tap into a sense of frustration and resentment among people who feel like the system isn't working for them.
Right.
And they offer a different vision for America.
Okay.
One that focuses on protecting American jobs, securing the border, and putting America back in a position of global dominance.
So when we talk about key issues for this wing, what are we talking about?
Think immigration control.
Okay.
Trade protectionism, getting tough on China, and reducing America's involvement in international organizations.
Right.
These issues have been driving the national conversation.
And those are all issues that were front and center during the Trump presidency.
Exactly. The debates we've been having about building a wall on the border with Mexico, renegotiating trade deals, and taking a harder line with China. Those are all signature issues for the populist nationalist wing. And they've been incredibly effective at mobilizing their base.
And when it comes to prominent figures in this wing, some of them are pretty obvious, right? Donald Trump himself, of course.
Of course.
But also people like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yes.
And Matt Gaetz.
Yes, those are definitely some of the most visible faces of this movement.
Right.
And what's interesting about someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene is her background. Before she got into politics, she owned a CrossFit gym.
Oh, what?
And was known for being very outspoken about her conservative views. She really embodies that outsider grassroots energy that's characteristic of this wing.
It's like she went from lifting weights to throwing political punches.
Exactly.
So how much influence would you say this wing has within the GOP overall?
Well, there's no denying that they have a lot of influence right now, especially at the grassroots level.
Right.
Groups like Turning Point USA and America First Action are actively mobilizing young conservatives and channeling that populist energy into political action.
And we saw how that energy can translate into electoral success in 2016.
We did.
Okay, let's move on to another wing that emerged as a reaction to what they saw as government overreach.
Right.
The Tea Party conservatives.
This movement really picked up steam during the Obama administration. As a backlash against his policies, especially the Affordable Care Act and all that stimulus spending.
So it sounds like they share a lot of core beliefs with the fiscal conservatives.
Absolutely.
Less government, less spending, lower taxes.
Absolutely. But the Tea Party tends to be even more uncompromising when it comes to demanding fiscal restraint.
Okay.
They see themselves as protectors of the Constitution and believe that the federal government has simply gotten too big and too intrusive.
So key issues for them would be things like balancing the budget, cutting taxes, shrinking the national debt, and getting rid of Obamacare.
You got it. And they've been pretty effective at pushing these issues to the top of the Republican agenda.
Okay.
Just look at the numerous attempts to repeal and replace Obamacare. The fight over raising the debt ceiling and the constant calls for tax cuts. These are all battles that the Tea Party has been waging for years.
And who are some of the key figures associated with this movement?
Well, Ted Cruz is a major figure who came out of the Tea Party movement.
Okay.
He's known for his hardcore conservatism and his willingness to challenge the establishment even within his own party. And then there's Mike Lee, a senator from Utah, who's another strong advocate for limited government and fiscal responsibility.
Speaking of challenging the establishment,
Mike Lee is actually a descendant of one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence.
Really?
Francis Lightfoot Lee. It's interesting how that connection to the founding principles of the country seems to inform his political philosophy.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so how would you assess the Tea Party's influence within the GOP today?
Well, the movement itself has lost some of its steam since its peak in the early 2010s.
Okay.
However, many of its core principles have become mainstream within the Republican Party. The focus on fiscal conservatism, limited government, sticking to the original interpretation of the Constitution is now deeply embedded in the GOP's DNA.
So even though the Tea Party may not be making as many headlines these days, its impact is still being felt.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to a wing that's been especially influential in foreign policy, the neoconservatives.
This wing became prominent in the late 20th century and early 21st century. They're known for advocating a strong interventionist foreign policy. They believe in the importance of American leadership on the world stage and the need to promote democracy and human rights abroad, even if it means using military force.
So basically, they're the hawks of the Republican Party. Believing that America has a moral obligation to spread its values and get involved in global conflicts.
That's a fair assessment. They often look to figures like Ronald Reagan for inspiration and see the victory in the Cold War as a model for how America should exert its influence in the world.
So what are some of the key issues for them?
Increasing military spending. Confronting countries like Iran and North Korea, supporting democratic movements around the world, and maintaining a strong military presence globally are all priorities for them.
And these issues have been central to American foreign policy for decades.
Absolutely. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the interventions in Libya and Syria, the sanctions on Iran and North Korea, and the ongoing competition with China and Russia. Neoconservatives have been deeply involved in shaping how America approaches all of these issues.
So who are some of the big names associated with this wing?
Historically, people like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz were leading voices in the neoconservative movement. More recently, Liz Cheney has emerged as a strong advocate for their views, especially in her criticisms of Donald Trump's foreign policy and her hawkish stance on China and Russia.
She's definitely been a vocal critic of Trump's America First approach.
She argues that it weakens America's standing in the world. And it's interesting to note that she's the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was a key architect of the Iraq War, a defining moment for the neoconservative movement.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how her family ties and personal experiences have shaped her views.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how much influence do neoconservatives have in the Republican Party today?
Well, their influence has definitely waned since the peak of the Iraq War. The rise of populism and the growing sentiment against getting involved in foreign conflicts have pushed the Republican Party in a more isolationist direction.
So it seems like their interventionist approach might be falling out of favor.
It seems so.
Okay, we've got one last wing to explore. The paleoconservatives.
Yes. These folks are a fascinating mix of traditionalism, nationalism, and skepticism about globalism. You could say they're the throwback conservatives. Looking back to an earlier era in American politics.
So they're kind of like the guardians of the old ways.
Yeah.
Suspicious of modern trends and global interconnectedness.
That's a pretty good way to put it.
They
see themselves as defenders of traditional American values and institutions, and they're worried about the erosion of national sovereignty in a globalized world.
So what are some of their big issues?
They're focused on limiting immigration, opposing free trade agreements, promoting a non-interventionist foreign policy, and preserving American culture and traditions.
And those concerns seem to resonate with a certain segment of the Republican base.
Definitely, especially those who feel like economic and cultural changes have left them behind.
Who are some of the prominent figures associated with this wing?
Well, Pat Buchanan is probably the best-known paleoconservative. He ran for president 3 times on a platform of economic nationalism and cultural conservatism. More recently, commentators like Tucker Carlson have echoed some of these paleoconservative themes in their critiques of immigration, globalism, and what they see as the cultural elite.
They definitely tap into a sense of nostalgia.
They do.
And a desire for things to be the way they used to be.
Yeah.
Last question. How much influence do paleoconservatives have within the GOP?
They're definitely more on the fringes of the party. However, they've seen a resurgence in recent years, especially with the rise of populism. And all the debates we've been having about immigration and trade, they've been able to connect with some voters who feel like the country is losing its identity.
So even if they don't have a ton of political power, they're still shaping the conversation and influencing the direction of the party.
That's right. And that brings us to...
this is fascinating.
It
really is amazing how these different wings, even the ones that might seem less influential, can still have a ripple effect on the whole party.
They do. And what's fascinating is that they don't always stay neatly in their separate lanes. You see ideas and influences crossing over all the time. Like we were just talking about, the paleoconservatives and the populist nationalists might seem pretty different at first glance, but they both have that strong distrust of globalism and a real emphasis on national sovereignty.
It's definitely more complex than just slapping a Republican label on someone and calling it a day. There's so many layers to it.
Exactly. It's more like a puzzle where all these different pieces are trying to fit together. Sometimes they clash, sometimes they complement each other. But it's always dynamic and constantly evolving.
This deep dive has definitely changed how I think about the Republican Party.
Oh, good.
It's not just one big uniform block. It's more like a tapestry woven from all these different threads of ideas, beliefs, and personalities.
Well said.
And that's the beauty of taking a deep dive.
Exactly.
Go beyond the surface and gain a much deeper understanding of these complex topics.
Yes, you do.
But it doesn't end here now that you have this knowledge. I want you to think about this. How do you think these different wings will navigate the upcoming elections?
Ooh, good question.
Will they find common ground, or will their differences cause even more division within the party?
That's a great question to consider.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
It will.
Thanks for taking us on this deep dive.
You're welcome.
It's been really enlightening.
I'm glad. And remember, the exploration doesn't stop here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the topics that fascinate you.
Absolutely. No, thanks again.
You're welcome. What's really interesting is how all these different groups within the Republican Party, even though they seem separate on the surface, they actually intersect and influence each other.
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah, like take the paleoconservatives and the populist nationalist wing, for example. They both share that skepticism of globalism and that strong focus on national sovereignty.
It's like a Venn diagram of ideologies. With some areas of overlap and some areas where they completely diverge.
Exactly.
It definitely makes for a dynamic and sometimes unpredictable political scene.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes studying the Republican Party so captivating. It's not this static, monolithic entity. It's a constantly evolving mix of different ideas, interests, and personalities.
Well said. Okay, so we've taken a pretty deep dive into 8 distinct wings of the Republican Party.
We have.
The establishment, traditional conservatives.
Right.
The fiery populist nationalists.
Right.
The budget-conscious fiscal conservatives?
Yes.
The values-driven social conservatives?
Yeah.
The liberty-loving libertarians?
Okay.
The government-skeptical Tea Party conservatives?
Right.
The interventionist neoconservatives?
Yeah.
And the tradition-minded paleoconservatives?
Yes. We've explored a whole spectrum of beliefs and priorities that shape this complex political party.
And you, dear listener, now have a much deeper understanding.
You do.
Of the inner workings of the GOP than the average person.
Way more.
You can see how these different factions push and pull the party in different directions.
Right.
Creating both friction and opportunity.
Exactly.
So the next time you hear someone casually talking about the Republicans, as if they're all the same,
right,
you'll know better.
You will.
You'll be able to spot the nuances, the competing interests, and the historical undercurrents that make this such a fascinating and ever-changing political force.
And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for you to consider.
Okay.
Now that you've gotten this inside look at the different factions,
right,
which wing do you think is most likely to shape the future of the Republican Party?
Oh, that's a good one.
Will it be the establishment clinging to power?
Yeah.
Or will the populist wave continue to reshape the political landscape?
Right.
And what roles will the other wings play in this ongoing evolution?
That is a really great question. There's a lot at play here.
There is.
And it'll be fascinating to see how it all unfolds.
It will.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the wings of the Republican Party.
My pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey. Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep learning.
Keep learning.
And keep questioning the world around you.
Yeah, it really is amazing how all these different wings, even the ones that might seem less influential, can still have a ripple effect on the whole party.
They do, and what's fascinating is that they don't always stay neatly in their separate lanes.
Right.
You see ideas and influences crossing over all the time.
Yeah.
Like we were just talking about, the paleoconservatives and the populist nationalists might seem pretty different at first glance, but they both have that strong distrust of globalism and a real emphasis on national sovereignty.
It's definitely more complex than just slapping a Republican label on someone and calling it a day.
Right.
There's many layers to it.
Exactly. It's more like a puzzle where all these different pieces are trying to fit together.
Right.
Sometimes they clash, sometimes they complement each other, but it's always dynamic and constantly evolving.
This deep dive has definitely changed how I think about the Republican Party.
Oh, good.
It's not just one big uniform block. It's more like a tapestry woven from all these different threads of ideas, beliefs, and personalities.
Well said.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of taking a deep dive.
Exactly.
You go beyond the surface and gain a much deeper understanding of these complex topics.
Yes, you do, but it doesn't end here.
Right.
Now that you have this knowledge, I want you to think about this. How do you think these different wings will navigate the upcoming elections?
Oh, that's interesting.
Will they find common ground, or will their differences cause even more division within the party?
That's a great question to leave everyone with.
I think so.
Yeah, well, this has been another fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Thanks so much for joining us today on the deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you next